Welcome back. Today we will begin our lectures on Aristotle's ethics. And if you recall, in our introductory remarks on ethics, when I talked about virtue ethics, I said that the central question of virtue ethics, and apropos our discussions today, the central focus of Aristotle's ethics, which is the classic example of a virtue ethic, is what is the human good? And what virtue ethicists mean by this, what this question translates into, is the question, what constitutes human fulfillment or excellence? Or alternatively, what is the praiseworthy human life? Now, Aristotle gives more than one answer. That is, Aristotle thinks that there's more than one way to live excellently as a human being. And his answers will draw upon a broad tapestry of elements, including an analysis of human nature, of moral and civic virtue, the nature of contemplation, and the relationships of human beings to God. So Aristotle's conception of the good life, of the human good, is going to draw on all the resources of his broader philosophy and his view, his outlook on human nature. Aristotle, his dates are 384 to 322 BC. He's one of the two most important philosophers of antiquity, and many would argue of all time. The other, of course, is Plato, who was Aristotle's teacher. Aristotle was Plato's greatest student at the academy. Aristotle, in turn, was the tutor of Alexander the Great. Of course, the great emperor who conquered at that time, I believe, carved out the largest empire that the world had seen up until that date. And Aristotle also founded his own school later in his career. He founded a school called the Lyceum. It was also called the Peripatetic School, named after the Peripatos, which was a cloister-like walkway. And Aristotle's followers were often called Peripatetics because they were famous for walking around the Peripatos deep in discussion, deep in thought and discussion. The Lyceum quickly became the chief rival to Plato's Academy. And so Aristotle is important for having founded one of the two greatest philosophical schools of the ancient world. Aristotle wrote works in physics, cosmology, zoology, biology, logic, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, ethics, politics, and more. We don't have any of his actual writings. They were destroyed. Of course, in the ancient world, there was no mass duplication of text, so all that existed were handwritten copies, and we have none of the actual works of Aristotle written by his hand. What we have, the books that we have that go under the name Aristotle, are really collections of lecture notes taken from his courses. And there's a whole industry of Aristotle scholarship trying to figure out what exactly Aristotle's views were, given the fact that the texts that we have were put together by subsequent editors. Aristotle's influence is enormous. His physics and his cosmology became the official science of the Roman Catholic Church throughout the Middle Ages. And so Aristotle's picture of the basic picture of the universe was church dogma until the Renaissance. His philosophy more generally carried almost supreme authority. He is sort of the official Catholic philosopher, which is sort of interesting considering that Aristotle himself, of course, was a pagan, being an ancient Greek, particularly a Macedonian. And it's sort of a testimony to the sort of the universal appeal that his views held, that his views would become would sit at the center of Christian dogma for nearly a millennium. Actually, probably a little more than a millennium. Aristotle's was so central that indeed the medieval philosophers referred to him simply as the philosopher. as if he was the only one. So this is one of those people that you just simply can't avoid in philosophy. You can't take a philosophy course without learning about Aristotle, and I won't hide the fact that his Ethics is one of my favorite works, and indeed probably one of the ethical treatises that I agree with the most. So you'll find me probably uncommonly enthusiastic when in presenting this material. In our introductory remarks, when I first sort of introduced the subject of ethics, when we talked about virtue ethics, I talked about the functional notion, the functional conception of good. So the word good has many uses, but one of the uses that we employ it for is to denote excellence in a function. So when we talk about a good car, a good computer, a good runner, a good baseball pitcher, we're using the word good in a functional sense. In ancient Greece, the word was telos. The word telos in Greek means function or purpose, and so to sort of use the Greek lingo, what we're talking about in virtue ethics are teleological notions of the good that employ the term in its functional sense. And let's be a little more specific now about what we mean by a functional conception of the good, or a teleological conception of the good. A thing's distinctive purpose or function is its telos. So every object has a distinctive function. So the function of this pen, for example, is to write, of course. Right? There are any number of things I could use the pen for other than writing. I could use it, let's say, to prop open the window in my house. But that's not its distinctive function. That's sort of an accidental use to which it can be put. Now, of course, as you would probably expect in philosophy, there is an enormous amount of difficulty in laying out a principle by which one can distinguish essential from accidental functions. Aristotle has one way of going about this, and needless to say, it's been subject to the kind of criticism that you would expect a philosophy this old and this important to attract. But just suffice to say for now that things and activities and processes for Aristotle have distinctive functions, and the fulfillment of these functions or purposes constitute the thing's good. So, to speak again in this sort of ancient Greek way of speaking, the good of this pen is to write well. Right? Writing well is the fulfillment of its function. The fulfillment of its function is its good. What makes a pen a good pen, then, in the functional sense of good, is that it writes well. Aristotle gives a number of examples here, and I'll just read to you a few of the examples that Aristotle presents, and right on the first page, on page 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics in your readings. He says, there are many actions, skills, and sciences, and it happens that there are many ends as well. The end of medicine is health, that of shipbuilding a ship, that of military science victory, and that of domestic economy wealth. I'm sure you notice here that he uses the word end rather than good. These are all synonyms. Right? Something's end is its good. The end for which it exists, or the end for which it is made, right? The fulfillment of that end is its good. Right? So the reason why you engage in, as one of the examples he gives, is medical science. The purpose of engaging in medical science is to produce healthy people. So producing healthy people, or curing sickness, or increasing lifespan, those all constitute the goods of medicine. Right? The purpose or ends of military strategy is victory, is to win wars. And so victory constitutes the end, the good of military strategy. Right? A good military strategy is one that results in victory. Thus, victory constitutes the end or the good of military strategy, and so on and so forth. Example that's sort of very obvious, this case is an example of a thing rather than an activity, is a hammer, right? Right, the distinctive purpose or function of a hammer is to pound nails, or drive nails. I don't know, I'm suddenly wondering what the right verb is, but the purpose of a hammer is to drive nails, let's say. And so a good hammer is one that drives nails well. And so driving nails well constitutes the end or the good of a hammer. Okay. Now, oh, and just one more piece of way of speaking, because when we read Aristotle, it's important. We're dealing with an author from thousands of years ago, and so there are sorts of ways of speaking that we need to acclimate ourselves to. Aristotle is going to speak of a thing aiming at its end, or a process aiming at its end. So pounding nails well is the end at which hammers aim. Now, I know we don't normally today speak about inanimate objects as aiming at anything, but as we'll see in a moment, Aristotle conceives of the whole universe as being imbued with purpose, right? With direction. You think about purpose, purpose is always directed, right? A purpose, an aim or a purpose is always directed towards its end. And so in a quite literal sense, the hammer aims at its end, which is pounding nails well. Medical science aims at its end, which is health. Military science aims at its end, which is victory. Now, the prevailing view today is that only man-made things have genuine functions or purposes. That is, the only genuine functions and purposes that we acknowledge today are those that are the result of intention. Right? So we accept that a hammer has a genuine purpose or an end, and the reason is because it is a thing that is made on purpose. Right? A hammer is a man-made artifact that's made with a certain intention in mind, and it's this intent, as well as the hammer's design, that makes the hammer's purpose what it is. We don't today tend to speak of purposes or functions in nature. Or at least we don't believe that there are genuine purposes or functions in nature, although there is the appearance of purpose or function in nature. Right? And of course, the reason that we no longer think of there being purposes and functions in nature is because of the revolution in biology that occurred in the 19th century. Right? The Darwinian revolution, the theory of evolution by natural selection. Right? And what was so ingenious about the theory of evolution by natural selection is that it explained the appearance of purpose or intent, even though there is actually none. So, of course, just to sort of the briefest possible version of this, you have in any species of animals or plants random genetic mutations. Some of those genetic mutations will be conducive to the life of the animal or plant, given the environmental circumstances. Others will be detrimental. Those animals or plants with the detrimental genes will die and will not pass them on, and eventually those genes will vanish from the gene pool. Those animals and plants with the positive, with the beneficial genetic mutations, will thrive and will reproduce, and those genes will become a permanent fixture in the gene pool, or at least temporarily permanent in geological time. And now this is true even for parts of nature that seem obviously designed, right? So if you think about hearts or lungs or kidneys, these seem to have obvious functions, right? Right? Obviously, the function of the heart is to pump blood. Obviously, the function of the kidneys is to filter, right? Is to filter the blood. I think you can tell I haven't taken biology in a while. I know the function of the liver is to clean the blood. So the point is, there seem to be purposes and functions in nature. For example, in the case of internal organs, just as there are purposes and functions in the case of man-made objects. However, on the modern way of thinking, the way that we think today in science, those purposes and functions are in a sense accidental. They are not the result of intention. They're simply the result of an accidental fit between environment on the one hand and a set of random genetic mutations on the other. Because it's beneficial to have an organ that cleans your blood, the creatures with the genes that create that organ survive, and the creatures with the genes that didn't died. That's the sort of the quick version of this. So today, the prevailing view is that only man-made things have genuine functions or purposes. That is, today we typically only apply teleological language to man-made things, things that are made on purpose. The reason I'm belaboring this so long is because in the ancient world, there was a very, very different conception. Aristotle believed that everything, process, and activity, both natural and artificial, has a function or purpose. The entire universe, in Aristotle's view, is a purposeful zone of existence, if you want to call it that. Right? Purpose, or telos, is a central explanatory concept in ancient science, in ancient Greek science. Purpose is not an explanatory concept in modern science, and that has been true since the scientific revolution. Right? So you have the mechanical revolution in physics in the 17th and 18th century, you have the revolution in biology in the 19th century. Both of these revolutions abandoned purpose or telos as a central explanatory concept, preferring to explain in purely mechanical terms, in terms of brute mechanical processes. But for Aristotle, the entire universe is imbued with purpose. Everything in process and activity has a place within that gigantic universal purpose. So everything has its own distinctive purpose, its own distinctive essence, its own distinctive place, and its own distinctive function in the universe. And one does not understand anything unless one understands its purpose. That is, we really don't understand what a thing is or why it does what it does unless we know its essential nature, its essential characteristics, and its telos. That's why Aristotle says in the very first paragraph, page 3, paragraph 1, he says, every skill and every inquiry, and similarly every action and rational choice is thought to aim at some good. And so the good has been aptly described as that at which everything aims. It is clear that there is some difference between ends. Some ends are activities, while others are products, which are additional to the activities, and so on and so forth. So in Aristotle's conception, there is a universe which has one sort of gigantic universal purpose. And everything in process within that universe has its own distinctive nature and its own role to play in that larger purpose. So the investigation of essences, of essential characteristics, and purposes and functions is the most important task of science for Aristotle. Right? Science is in the business of uncovering essences and functions. And of course, you see the relationship between an essence and a function. A thing's essential characteristics are what determine its function. So it's because the hammer is made with a certain set of distinctive intentions and has a certain set of distinctive properties. Those are its essential characteristics. Those determine its function. So for Aristotle, because the understanding of telos, the understanding of function, is at the center of understanding the nature of things and their behavior, the investigation of essential characteristics and purposes is the most important task of science. Now, the Greek word for the excellence that is distinctive of human beings is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. That word translates literally as human flourishing or human well-being. So it is simply a name tag for that which constitutes the human good, that which is the fulfillment of the distinctively human function. Remember, everything in nature has a distinctive function. And this applies even to whole species. Aristotle thinks that the human race as a species has a distinctive function within the larger function of the universe. So the word for this distinctive good, human good, is eudaimonia. Now, it is commonly translated as happiness. So you'll notice in your own readings that when Aristotle talks about the chief good, about the human good, it is defined as happiness. This alas is an unfortunate translation, but it appears in most translations. There are very few which sort of stick to the letter of the word, and that's simply for purposes of readability. The problem, of course, is that the word happiness has a modern connotation. Right? When we use the word happy, we mean to denote a pleasant feeling or state of mind. Right? When I say I'm happy, what I'm basically saying is I feel good. Now the problem is that this modern sense of happiness is utterly not what Aristotle means when he talks about the human good. When Aristotle talks about the ends of all human activity, about what constitutes human flourishing, he is not saying that what constitutes human flourishing is a life of feeling good. And so I find the word happiness to be an unfortunate translation for eudaimonia. Nonetheless, it is the translation that we find in most translations of the Ethics, and so we just have to remind ourselves that in Aristotle, the word happiness is what we would consider a technical term that has a formal definition. Happiness for Aristotle is simply the human good. It is the translation for eudaimonia. Of course, we don't know yet what he thinks that is, what he thinks human flourishing consists of, but we'll get to that very shortly. We get a clue, incidentally, when Aristotle tells us the science Aristotle identifies the science in which the study of the human good occurs. You know, today, when we talk about human beings, human nature, human behavior, we inevitably turn to scientists to explain things to us. We turn to biologists, we turn to psychologists, we turn to neurophysiologists. Interesting, then, to see what Aristotle thinks is the primary subject area who devoted to the study of human nature. Aristotle says that the science in which we study human nature and the human function and the human good is politics. It's not biology, it's not psychology, it's politics. Politics is the science in which we study human nature, the human function, and the human good. And this alone tells us volumes, right? For one thing, it shows us that unlike today, Aristotle does not have a reductive mindset. Right? Today, even though we acknowledge that human beings occupy and operate within a social and within a civil sphere, we today generally tend towards reductive explanations. Right? So we want to reduce our explanations to their most base components, which is why we tend to turn to hard sciences when we want to explain any phenomena. Right? So sure, human beings engage in civic life and in social life, but isn't that simply a manifestation of the psychology? And isn't their psychology simply a manifestation of their neurochemistry? And so if we really want to understand human nature, we should do neurochemistry. Right? That's the sort of the modern way of thinking. That is the classic modern reductive mindset. Aristotle doesn't think this way at all. And the fact that he thinks that politics is the chief science the area through which we study the human good tells us that. Aristotle believes it's not in the biological, but at the social and civic levels of life where human nature is most fully revealed. That is, we function in the most human way. We most fulfill our human nature at the social and civic levels of life. Indeed, Aristotle is going to say biology doesn't tell us anything distinctive to human nature. Right? Everything at the end of the day everything on the earth at the end of the day that's alive is made out of carbon. So what good is studying carbon going to do to tell us anything about this distinctive about human nature? Right? Everything ultimately is made of molecules. What's distinctive about human beings, Aristotle thinks, is the social and civic forms of life in which we engage, and it's there, at that level, that human nature and the human good is most fully revealed. This is why politics, for Aristotle, is the science in which human nature and the human good are most completely understood. Okay, so we know so far that there is a human good, that there's a form of excellence or fulfillment that represents the end of all human activity. The question now is, what is that good? What does that good consist of? Simply to say that it's eudaimonia without saying what eudaimonia is, what the substance of eudaimonia is an empty exercise. And we can't know what eudaimonia is unless we first know what a human being's essential characteristics and functions are. Right? So eudaimonia is simply the name for whatever it is constitutes human fulfillment, but we don't know what that is yet. And in order to know what that is, in order to know what constitutes human fulfillment is, we need to know what the human function is. In order to know what the human function is, we need to know what defines human nature. What are the defining characteristics of a human being? That human beings do have essential characteristics and functions, Aristotle takes for granted. As I've already mentioned, his entire cosmology is predicated on the notion that the universe is imbued with purpose. But secondly, Aristotle makes sort of the following observation. He says, look, all the parts of a human being have distinctive functions. Okay? So all your body parts, your organs, your musculature, your skeleton, your nervous system, all have distinctive functions. So the parts of a human being have distinctive functions. And furthermore, he says, the positions, professions, activities that human beings occupy and engage in have distinctive functions. Right? So there's a distinctive function to being a cabinet maker, to being a baseball pitcher, and so on and so forth. Aristotle says, wouldn't it be odd if the parts of a human being all have functions, the roles that a human being fulfills have functions, but that the human being itself has no function? He says that would be odd and would not be what one would expect. I'm not saying that this is necessarily an argument for there being a human function. And Aristotle doesn't really require an argument for there being a human function. His cosmology entails it. But he does make those observations. You look on page 11 towards the bottom. First he says, perhaps saying that happiness is the chief good sounds rather platitudinous, and one might want its nature to be specified still more clearly. It is possible that we might achieve that if we grasp the characteristic activity of a human being. So this is the part where he says, look, it's not enough to just sort of say the human good is eudaimonia, unless we say what eudaimonia is. And then he quickly acknowledges, but in order to do that, we have to say what is the distinctive activity or function of a human being. He goes on to say, for just as the good of a flute player, a sculptor, or any practitioner of a skill, or generally whatever has some characteristic activity or action, is thought to lie in its characteristic activity, so the same would seem to be true of a human being, if indeed he has a characteristic activity. Well, do the carpenter and the tanner have characteristic activities and actions and a human being none? Has nature left him without a characteristic activity to perform? Or, as there seem to be characteristic activities of the eye, the hand, the foot, and of each part of the body, should one assume that a human being has some characteristic activity over and above all else? Right, so here he's saying, look, yes, my cosmology entails that everything in the universe has a function, but forgetting about that, wouldn't it be awfully odd if, on the one hand, all the parts of a human being have functions, and on the other hand, all the roles that a human being can occupy have functions, but that the human being himself or herself has no function? He then goes on to try and figure out, well, what the human function is, the human purpose. His method of identifying this, and remember, in order to identify something's purpose, we have to identify its defining characteristics. Right? Before I can know what a hammer is for, I have to know what a hammer is. And indeed, there's a kind of a dog chasing his tail here. In order to know what something is, I need to know what its function. What is its function? In order to know its function, I need to know what it is. And the way that we come to know either one is through a process of a kind of bootstrapping, right? Aristotle's way of identifying the distinguishing characteristics of a thing or a process or an activity is through what I'm just going to call the method of differentiation. What Aristotle will do is compare one class of things with another, in order to note those characteristics that the one class has in common with the other and those that differentiate it from the other. For Aristotle, those characteristics which differentiate one class of things from every other class of things. In other words, those characteristics which all and only the members of this class have, those are the defining characteristics of the class. Right? Obviously, he's not going to want to say that characteristics that we have in common with other classes are our defining characteristics, because, of course, those won't differentiate us. So look, human beings and cows are both warm-blooded. So being warm-blooded is not going to be the characteristic that defines a human being, because that will fail to distinguish human beings from cows. Right? A defining characteristic is a distinguishing characteristic. Right? So the way that Aristotle is going to go about identifying the defining characteristics of a human being, and thus the human purpose and ultimately the human good, is by comparing human beings to other things, to other animals and to plants. In other words, to compare human beings to the rest of life and to see what characteristics differentiate human beings from everything else. So he's going to go through a list of characteristics of live things and see which of these characteristics distinguishes human beings from every other living thing. Those are going to be the defining human characteristics, and those are going to determine the human function and the human good. Now, of course, the most basic characteristic that all living things have is that they're alive. Aren't you glad you went to college to learn that? Right? Right, the obvious thing the obvious and most basic characteristic of all living things is life, the characteristic of being alive. And as Aristotle rightly points out, being alive or having life cannot be the defining characteristic of a human being, because this will not distinguish a human being even from a blade of grass. Okay? Now, think about, I mean, this is sort of a very, as obvious as it seems, it's a very actually profound point. Right? Because essences, defining characteristics, are determinative of functions and purposes, and thus of conceptions of fulfillment, of the good. What Aristotle is saying is, look, simply being alive can't be what constitutes a good human life. Because simply being alive is what every shrub does, what every plant does, what every blade of grass does. So if, let's say, at the end of your days, all you'd done was be alive, hadn't done anything else except for eat, breathe, go to the bathroom, and so on, we wouldn't want to say that that's a good human life, because that's not a life that's in any way distinct even from the most basic life form, like an amoeba. So when Aristotle says that, quote, he says, when he asks at the bottom of page 11, he says, he's talking about what are the distinctive characteristics of a human being. He says, what sort of thing might it be? Living is obviously shared even by plants. While what we are looking for is something special to a human being, we should therefore rule out the life of nourishment and growth. What he's saying is, the life of mere nourishment and growth is not the good life for a human being. It's not what human flourishing consists of, because this is what every creature and plant does. And so Aristotle would want to actually criticize a person who'd done nothing in their life other than eat, sleep, and sort of, respirate. Right? Aristotle would want to say, you wasted your distinctively human characteristics. You did nothing more than a blade of grass would do. The next characteristic that he takes into account is sentience, by which is meant sort of the cluster of sense perception and sensation or feeling. Right, this is something that all animals do. Or any animal with a basic sensory apparatus and nervous system. So once again, the life of sentience, the property of being sentient, is not going to be a defining human characteristic, because it's not anything that will distinguish a human being from a cow, a dog, a mouse. And thus, the sentient life, the life of mere sensory experience and sensation, is not going to be the human good, is not going to constitute the human good. Now, this is perhaps a bit more of a challenge, a bit more of a rebuke. Right? Nobody really thinks that the simply living, eating, drinking, sleeping, living and respirating, right? No one really thinks that that is the good life. And so it's not much a rebuke to deny that that's the good life. But I think an awful lot of people think that the life of mere sense experience is just fine. I mean, is it not the case that, would you not suspect or agree that there are any number of people who live entirely for pleasure, for sensory pleasure? And I don't necessarily mean that in any sort of negative, in any sort of morally corrupt sort of sense, but just people who live to enjoy themselves. What Aristotle wants to say is, you're not doing anything different from what a cow does, or a dog. That is, you are not in doing that, you are not exercising any distinctively human characteristics. So even if your life is good, it's not a good human life. Right? Right? The life of mere sensation might be a good mammal life, right? Or a good animal life. It's not a good human life because it's not distinctively a human life. Right? There's nothing distinctively human about it. Now, finally, the last thing that Aristotle comes to is activity under the jurisdiction of reason, or activity in accordance with reason. And by activity, I mean both mental and physical activity, so both thought and what we call action. Aristotle says, here indeed we find the distinctively human characteristic, the capacity to think and act under the guidance of reason. That is what is unique, that is what is distinctive to human beings. So on page 12, he's just gone through comparing people to plants. Now he's gone through comparing people to animals. He says next would be some sort of sentient life, but this again is clearly shared by the horse, the ox, indeed by every animal. What remains is a life concerned in some way with action of the element that possesses reason. Okay. And herein, finally, we discover the distinctively human characteristics. The capacity to think and to act under the guidance of reason. And so now, thinking in the way that Aristotle does, if what distinguishes human beings, if the defining characteristic of a human being is the ability to act and think under the guidance of reason, then the human function, the human purpose is to think and act under the guidance of reason. And the excellent human life will be a life in which one has thought and acted under the guidance of reason. As for Aristotle, the life of rational behavior and thought is the good life. That is the human good. Okay? We're inching our way forward. We know more than we started. We now know what the human good is, but of course, what we know is still very shallow. That is, we haven't gotten that much depth. We know now that the human good consists of a life of rational behavior and thought, because that is the purpose that attaches to what is distinctive about human beings, the capacity to think and to act rationally. But we still don't know yet what counts as rational behavior and thought. We don't know exactly how Aristotle means the word rational, and as we shall find out, his conception of reason has more than one facet. That is, there's more than one type of reasoning of which human beings are capable, and the different types of reasoning attach to different kinds of activity, to different forms of life. Right. We don't know what Aristotle means by rational, and we don't know, therefore, what constitutes rational behavior and thought yet. We just know that whatever constitutes rational behavior and thought, it is the life of rational behavior and rational thinking that is the good for a human being. just to give you a little teaser, the life of rational behavior and thought is going to have two, in a sense, manifestations. One is a life of moral and civic virtue, okay? And the other is going to be a life spent in the pursuit of knowledge. These two forms of life corresponds to two different senses of rationality, both of which Aristotle thinks define human nature. Okay, next time we're going to go into more detail about what I'm going to call the anatomy of the human soul, right? Aristotle's picture of the human sort of template, human character, and these different conceptions of rationality and where in the human soul they rest and what their distinctive, what it is that they do in a human being's life. So next time we're going to give a sort of an Aristotelian analysis of the human soul, as well as an analysis of moral and civic virtue. Okay. But there's two things I want you to think about as you're reading on. The first is, do you think of the virtuous person as one who doesn't have any bad desires, or one who has bad desires but successfully resists them? I'll ask that again. Do you think of the virtuous person, the good person, as one who doesn't have bad desires, or is it someone who does have bad desires but is able to resist or otherwise sublimate those bad desires? That's the first question. Second thing I want you to think about is, Aristotle is going to talk about virtue in terms of moderation. For Aristotle, the good person in the morally virtuous sense is one who is moderate in his temperament and his behavior. And what I want to ask you is, and this is sort of asking you to make a sort of a sociological observation, okay? Sort of reflect on your culture, on the culture around you. Do we today generally think of virtue in terms of moderation as Aristotle does, or do we think of virtue in terms of extremes? The good person is the person who never does this or who always does that. Okay. So do we today generally think of virtue in terms of moderation as Aristotle does, or do we today think of virtue in terms of extremes? And I want you to come up with some examples. Right? And these are ways of working with the concepts that Aristotle is going to introduce to us, and the ways of thinking that Aristotle is going to introduce to us. Okay? So until next time, keep reading and think about those questions, and we'll pick this up where we left off. Thank you very much.